So I want to introduce you to Carlo Treviso, who very graciously flew in from Chicago to present his new book. You'll find this book, I think, fascinating. You'll find his lecture fascinating. So I'm just going to leave it to Carlo, and he's going to give you this wonderful tour of Sicilia and Siciliana and this historical thriller.
Historical thriller.
So I'm turning it over to him.
All right, thank you. Good evening. My name is Carlo Treviso. I'm the author of the new historical thriller novel titled Siciliana, or Siciliana in Sicilian. First, please let me extend a big thank you to the Dante Alighieri Society of Massachusetts. It's a real pleasure and honor to be speaking tonight here at your great organization, so thank you very much. I thought I'd start by speaking for about 30 minutes and then open the floor up to questions and have more of a dialogue, which I always find to be quite fun. So let's get started. As I said, my name is Carlo Treviso, and I'm named after my late grandfather, my nanu, the original Carlo Treviso. So in the Treviso family, I'm the firstborn son to be born on American soil. And as such, I received the great honor of carrying on my nanu's name. Nanu was a shipwright from Porticello, Sicily, a small fishing village outside of Palermo. He built all kinds of boats by hand, fishing boats, rowboats. He took great pride in his work, and he used to say, "It's not the blade that makes the man, it's the man that makes the blade." And this was in reference to his adze, which is considered a shipwright's most important carving tool. And on the outside, Nanu was a skilled craftsman and was as tough as nails, pun intended. But underneath that tough exterior, he was incredibly creative. He had the soul of an artist. In the early 70s, Nanu moved the family from Porticello to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where there was a growing community of Sicilian immigrants there. And as a shipwright, Nanu was not at all shy about his love and appreciation for Venetian gondolas. He loved Venetian gondolas, their sleek design, their elegant allure. And when I was a child, I had the impressionable experience of watching my nanu build 3 gondolas in his garage alongside my dad and uncle. My uncle Antonio is pictured here. Nanu eventually launched the gondolas on the Milwaukee River as a small business. This was my nanu's not so subtle way of saying, I love my culture and I'm going to celebrate and conserve it through my creativity. On the left is a picture of the former Milwaukee mayor of Milwaukee, christening one of the bows. And there on the right, the gondolas were even featured in a brochure photo shoot for the Milwaukee Tourism Bureau. And because of this, they became quickly known as the darlings of Milwaukee. And not even a year later, Nanu partnered with Milwaukee's oldest cultural festival, Festa Italiana, and offered rides to festival goers on the lakefront lagoon. And the local news here even covered the story, and I thought it would be fun to share with you the short clip right now.
Festa Italiana, Milwaukee's oldest ethnic festival, captures the spirit of Italy.
And one family of gondola makers rose in the romance of Venice to Milwaukee shores. Tracy Robinson has the story.
Newlyweds Rosa and Carlo Testa from Sicily are honeymooning here in Milwaukee, and to their delight, they found a romantic reminder of their homeland, the gondola. Cousin Rose Cornelison translates.
And it's kind of nostalgic for them also to come and see this, to be able to go on a ride like this, to go on the gondola.
The Venetian-style boats are built by Milwaukee's very own Treviso family of gondoliers.
We just try to bring back a little piece of Italy, of Venice, so to speak, on the Milwaukee River.
Father Carlo and brothers Gaetano and Antonio build the boats in their garage as a hobby. So far, the Trevisos have built 3 gondolas at a cost of 7 months and $8,000 each.
It gives you a romantic feeling that, you have to go to Venice to experience the same thing.
So if you can't afford a flight to Venice, you can enjoy a romantic ride on a gondola right here in Milwaukee for about $11 per person.
The Trevisos say they witnessed dozens of marriage proposals on the gondolas, and for newlyweds Rosa and Galogero, the gondola is a romantic ride they wish they could take all the way back to Italy. Tracy Robinson, TV6 News, Milwaukee.
Oh, what a voice. What would a gondola ride be without somebody singing, right? So this is a photo of my 2 younger sisters and I sitting in one of those gondolas shortly after they first launched. And sitting there in that red velvet seat, little did I realize that witnessing my nanu accomplish such an inspiring feat would instill in me certain values that I would carry with me for the rest of my life. Like a young squire being knighted by the old master, my Nanu instilled me with the values of celebrating our culture through acts of creativity and conservation. It would then become my oath as a true Sicilian knight to follow in his footsteps and live out these values. When I was 12 years old, I wrote and published my first novel. It had a print run of 1 copy, written by hand in blue ink, and bound together in 3 spiral notebooks complete with chapter headings and illustrations. The novel was titled The Fantasy. It was a historical thriller, obviously, and you seemed like a great crowd, so I thought it might be fun to do a little 30-minute dramatic reading for you today, but perhaps I'll save that for a future talk. As I mentioned, I'm the first-generation son of a Sicilian immigrant family, and growing up, when I would mention my Sicilian heritage to anyone unfamiliar with its past, the typical response usually had some use of that notorious M word. Oh, like the mafia, hey, Godfather. I mentioned Sicily in literature or film, and one might imagine that aging Don stroking a white cat or a low-level mobster running a casino. And more often than not, Sicilians are portrayed in popular entertainment in a negative context: gangsters, grifters, hustlers. And I always thought that my Sicilian heritage deserved better than how it was depicted in popular entertainment and the media. So, as a lifelong lover of fiction and cinema, I decided that the only way to confront these negative perceptions was to change the narrative altogether. As Joseph Campbell once said, if you want to change the world, change the story. Enter the historical thriller novel, Siciliana. I decided to write a novel about Sicily that had nothing to do with the mafia. I wanted to tell a new kind of story, a story that transported the reader to 13th century Sicily, to chronicle a turbulent and brutal period in the island's history, while celebrating the courage, culture, and heritage of its people. So through a rich blend of imagination and actuality, I set out to depict a vivid account for the struggle of the Sicilian nation, or as I say in the book, an exquisite realm of forbidden knights, forgotten fortresses, and fallen kings. I'd like to take you now to a very specific date in Sicilian history. So Siciliana takes place in the year 1282 AD, and at that time, the French occupied Sicily. As you may know, Sicily's been conquered by every civilization in the Mediterranean, from the Greeks to the Romans, the Arabs to the Normans, and by 1282, this was the French, or Angevins as they were called. And the Angevins were very abusive. There were a lot of cases of rape and molestation, very vulgar acts of violence against the Sicilian people. But that all changed on March 30th, the evening of the Easter Vigil, known as Vespers. As the Sicilian people came together in Palermo, the French soldiers they showed up drunk, belligerent. They essentially crashed the party. They started bullying the men, molesting the women. And the legend goes that one woman allegedly took out her stiletto blade, which was a type of short sword. She stabbed a French soldier, and she cried, "Morano li Francesi," or "Death to the Angevins." And at that moment, all of the Sicilians of Palermo took out their blades and cried, "Death to the Angevins." And what preceded was a very intense uprising in the city, where the people of Palermo essentially slaughtered 2,000 French soldiers, men, women, anybody who spoke French. There was a fatal verbal test that the Sicilians would conduct to root out hidden French citizens. They would cry, "Say ciccioli," or chickpea. And if a French accent was detected, the person's throat was slashed ear to ear. It was a complete, brutal massacre, which turned into a larger revolution across the entire island. The dramatic uprising became known to history as the Sicilian Vespers. And for a brief moment in time, the Sicilians actually took back the island from the French. That is until the Spanish eventually came in and conquered them again, unfortunately. Now, as I mentioned, I grew up with 2 younger sisters and was surrounded by a lot of strong women in my family. I have a huge respect for the strong female hero, and I decided that I wanted Siciliana to be told through a distinctly feminist lens, by centering that story around the woman who sparked the Sicilian Vespers uprising. So Siciliana tells the harrowing tale of a young woman named Etna Vesperi, born the daughter of a revered Sicilian knight. Her name pointedly suggesting Mount Etna, the Sicilian volcano, ready to blow. As a child, Etna witnesses the destruction of her father's vineyard by Angevin soldiers and escapes with her life. But it's not until years later in Palermo, as the evening bells are tolling for Vespers, when Etna, of the volcanic spirit, is confronted by a nefarious Angevin sergeant and faced with an overwhelming choice. A choice that would transform her into a fearsome force who inspires the Sicilian people to revolt against the Angevin regime at all costs. A choice that will connect her ever more deeply to her home, its people, and the meaning of family. It's here, in her darkest hour, that this dauntless Sicilian woman steps out of obscurity and into the pages of history. The legend of Siciliana is born. And as a fun fact, in writing the characterization for Etna Vesperi, I drew inspiration from my own sister, Andrea. I intentionally incorporated my sister's appearance, strength, personality into the character. So Etna herself then, you could say, becomes a tribute to my own sister, to whom I also dedicate the book. Now, on top of this broader revolution story, I wanted to give the reader a taste for the various cultural influences that were left upon Sicily. I talk about the Greek influence, the Arabs, the Normans. The Greeks, for example, were the culture that brought grapes to the island. Mount Etna, the largest volcano in Europe, provides the perfect condition for growing grapes. It has coarse, rocky soil, it's fast draining, full of nutrients from the lava, and what you get is a cindery, berry-like red wine known as Etna Rosso. Though it was the Arab conquest that I think brought all of the best stuff. They introduced foods like arancini and pistachio and cannoli, that famous cannoli, gelato, or should I say they perfected the process of making gelato. Now, you're probably wondering, how do they make gelato on an island that was scorching hot? Well, it's actually quite simple. You go up to the mountains, you collect some snow, you bring it down, you mix it with milk, fruits, nuts, and what you get is a very rudimentary form of ice cream or gelato. And the Normans, of course, they built the opulent fortress-like palaces and cathedrals that you can currently see in Palermo, where the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II established the first Sicilian poetry school, which is actually credited for laying the foundation for what would eventually become the formal Italian language. So there's a lot of history there. Siciliana even depicts elements of the Swabian or German influence. So in the 13th century, there was an order of knights who swore to protect the kingdom of Sicily. They were called the Ordo Teutoni, the Teutonic Order. And in the opening pages of Siciliana, the Teutonic Knights are outlawed by the French tyrant Ray Carlo and are driven underground, forced into a life on the Rhine. Some escaped to the Holy Land, while others were able to disappear into the routines of daily life and created a secretive network of informants, safe houses, and call signs in order to communicate with one another. That is until the fateful night of Vespers, when the Teutonic Knights finally resurge from hiding to help Etna and the Sicilian rebels take back the island from the Angevins. So by incorporating the intrigue of the Teutonic Knights throughout the novel, it allowed me to go deeper into what I call Sicily's knight lore and bring another perspective of the personalities and groups that existed on the island during that time. Throughout Siciliana, I revisit a recurring theme that Sicily was the original melting pot of the Mediterranean, a human stew of cultures and civilizations. That scary-looking guy there in the corner, he represents the dangerous French villain known as General Guy de Rochefort. So in the novel, Rochefort is a blood-hungry and genocidal warmonger, and he plans to eradicate all of the Sicilians from the island. And throughout the story, he frequently refers to Sicilians as having dirty blood. He says they have the blood of gypsies, which he uses as an insult against them to describe the mishmash of cultures that makes up the Sicilians' bloodline. So this is a screenshot of my actual DNA breakdown, where you can see my colorful Sicilian cocktail. While it's 75% Italian Sicilian, you can see there's a little Greek, there's a little Levantine, North African, all these representing the various conquerors and cultures in Sicily over the past 3 millennia. So suffice it to say, if General Rochefort were here today, he would likely have my pretty little head on his chopping block. So one of the first comments I hear from new readers is about the novel's book cover. They say, you have this really intriguing book cover with this horrifying image of Medusa. What's that all about? And basically what the cover represents is a modernized interpretation of the Sicilian flag. So as part of Siciliana, I wanted to give the reader a taste for how this flag could have come into existence. There's not a lot of historical record about who designed this flag or where it really came from, so I used the opportunity in the book to have Etna Vesperi, the Siciliana, essentially design the Sicilian flag as she's going through her journey. Because at that time, Sicily was kind of tribal. People were spread out by villages. There wasn't a real sense of unification. And Etna decides on her journey, you know what, Sicily needs an identity, and I'm going to create a flag for us that we can wave when we head out to face the French in battle. And as the story progresses, you get the various breadcrumbs of how that flag was created, which I tie into the various narrative themes that are explored in the novel. Medusa, as you know, is an ancient Greek character, the maiden turned monster turned myth, much like Siciliana herself. And in the original story, Medusa was a beautiful Sicilian woman. And the story goes, she was taking a walk one day along the shore when Poseidon, the god of the sea, saw her, thought she was so beautiful, and said, I must have her, and he accosted her. Now, Medusa was eventually rescued by Athena, the goddess of wisdom, but this is where the story gets funny. So as a punishment to Poseidon, she turns Medusa into a demon. So she turns Medusa into a demon, but that was actually an act to protect her. She gave her snakes for hair and a power to turn men into stone, which was meant to actually protect her from all of these bad men trying to come after her. And as such, Medusa eventually became a symbol of protection against evil. So if you go to Sicily today, you'll see a lot of imagery of Medusa on vases and cloths, and that's because she's considered a totem to help ward off evil. With the Triskele, there are essentially two meanings behind this symbol. The first meaning is that it represents the 3 points of the island of Sicily. So as you know, Sicily is an island, that's essentially a triangle. But there's another more dramatic meaning behind this. So in the Mount Etna region of Sicily, there's a term they use that's called simu sufarum, which means we are nothing but sulfur. And it essentially means Sicilians are helplessly strewn about the earth like sulfur from a volcano. And in Siciliana, when Etna is a little girl, her father teaches her that she must fight that perception. He points to the 3 legs of the Triskele and reminds her that no matter where you throw a Sicilian, we will always land standing. Conquerors can keep kicking us through the annals of history, but we will always land on our feet. And that's what this symbol comes to represent. And finally, the artichoke buds. Now, this is a very controversial element to the cover because a lot of people say that those buds are actually wheat ears. Some people say that they're corn ears. And I've gotten a lot of feedback and questions about why did you include artichokes on the Sicilian flag? Wikipedia says those are wheat ears. Well, there's actually a very specific historical connotation for this. So at the heart of the book, and this is going to be a bit of a pun, is around this term called koska. And koska is Sicilian for artichoke, hence the heart. And an artichoke, as you know, has layered leafy blades over the top of it per se, protecting the fruit, which essentially is a metaphor for the Sicilian family unit. Because back in that day, everybody carried stiletto blades, which were short swords basically, and with the blade of the stiletto is how you protected your family. So when all of the Sicilians came together with their blades, they created that koska, or artichoke, of the family. So on top of this broader revolution story, you get this contemplation of what it means to be koska, what it means to be a true Sicilian family. And you might even recognize the similarities to another word, Cosa Nostra, which the mafia uses to describe themselves. And that's derived from the same concept. And if you actually look closely at an image of the Sicilian flag, I think it looks a lot more like an artichoke than it does an ear of wheat, which is longer and more feathery. So while this interpretation of the Sicilian flag might seem controversial to traditionalists per se, this is where the fun of writing novels comes in. That is, in the author's ability to take creative liberties with history for the benefit of creating compelling and impressionistic drama. So growing up, one of my favorite books was The Hunchback of Notre Dame. And there's a famous story about how the author Victor Hugo essentially wrote the novel to help save Notre Dame Cathedral, which at that time had been crumbling from neglect and vandalism over the centuries. Mr. Hugo felt that if he depicted an exciting story set in and around Notre Dame, that he could inspire the citizens of Paris to rise up and protect their Gothic heritage. He said famously to the press when he released the book, "A universal cry must finally go out to call the new France to the aid of the old." And like Mr. Hugo, it so happens that I had a very similar approach in writing Siciliana. Before I'm an author, I consider myself a conservationist. I have a deep passion for conserving history, culture, environment. I'm an active supporter and advocate of organizations like UNESCO and the World Wildlife Fund. And I wanted to incorporate that mission of conservation into the book as a sort of secondary mission. UNESCO is a program run by the UN that protects ancient heritage sites around the world against war, vandalism, destruction, and in Sicily there are actually about 7 of them. For example, in the city of Palermo, Palermo Cathedral is the famous Norman-built cathedral that towers over the city's main streets. And many of the scenes in Siciliana are set against these real locations, so you can actually go there. You can walk around where the characters walked. You can see where the battles were fought. I wanted readers to be able to read the book and then go to Sicily and actually experience these places for real. And you can say, oh, this is the cathedral where Etna held her rally, or this is the slope on Mount Etna volcano where the Sicilians fought the French. I wanted to help give readers a sense of appreciation that these places actually exist and that you can still visit them today, and hopefully help conserve them for future years to come. These are actual photos from my sister Andrea that she took on her trip to Sicily this past summer. I mean, what a perfect thing to do, to go to Sicily while reading Siciliana, while you're actually there in the land. And she took pictures in front of the actual locations where the story takes place. You'll see here Palermo Cathedral, the slopes of Mount Etna, and even the Taormina Greek Theater, which is where the 3rd act climax of the novel takes place. So in Taormina, there's a big battle scene where the people essentially follow the example of Palermo and rise up against their oppressors as well. And on the environment side, the World Wildlife Fund has a program in Sicily that protects their native birds of prey on the island. And that program is called Life Conrasi. And it focuses on these 3 raptors that are shown here. And as such, I decided to incorporate eagles and eagle symbolism into the book in various ways. I mean, there are quite a few plot Easter eggs that I won't get into here, but if I've done my job right, the reader should come away from Siciliana with a majestic and vivid portrait of eagles and eagles in Sicily. So these 2 missions, historical preservation and environmentalism, collide in a character in Siciliana known as Don Rapaci. So Don Rapaci is a mysterious knight who works in the shadowy streets of Palermo to essentially terrorize and assassinate unsuspecting Angevin soldiers. As a self-appointed vigilante and protector, he's made it his life mission to protect Sicily's culture against the French, who are desecrating and outlawing their traditions and way of life. He lives in a hidden cave on Monte Pellegrino where he stores banned Sicilian artifacts like tapestries and marionettes. And he also practices falconry with his majestic companion, the Sicilian golden eagle named Rosalia. And I was not so subtle in the naming of this character. Don, of course, is the Sicilian title for lord or master, and Rapaci is Sicilian for raptor, the master raptor, so to speak. So it goes without saying that Don Rapaci might actually be my favorite character in the book. And if Etna, the Siciliana, represents my sister's spirit, I like to think that Don Rapaci represents myself. I'd like to play you now a small excerpt from the Siciliana audiobook experience. The novel was narrated by a Chicago voice artist named Lauren Etzo. I personally find her voice to be quite captivating. And in this clip, she reads a small excerpt from the novel that precedes the opening prologue, so please enjoy.
April 1282. I've forgotten much about my childhood years, but I remember the lava, the roaring fountain of red, molten rock erupting from the black earth, the glowing orange serpent slithering down the flanks of the volcano, deliberately, violently. Yet in the path of its devastation came new growth from the ugly soil, new life, a new era. I am lava. I am Siciliana.
Very dramatic stuff there. So, reflecting back on that night, sitting in my nanu's gondola, the night I was spiritually knighted and instilled with his values, little did I realize how fully and completely I would actually be following in his footsteps. Not only in the writing of Siciliana, but also in a curious little incident that would transpire a few months after I published the book, and I'd like to tell you about that now. So back in September of this year, I had the incredible honor of being invited to participate in my hometown of Milwaukee's 2022 Festa Italiana celebration. It was a fantastic event, a sold-out crowd, and in attendance that weekend was my little cousin Emmanuel, pictured here getting his book signed by me. And Emmanuel came up to me and he told me a story about how his teacher asked everyone in his class to bring a book to school to read during their quiet time. And of course, he decided to bring in Siciliana. But it wasn't until I was driving home that night back to Chicago when the gravity of that moment truly hit me. So here was a 14-year-old kid whose popular introduction to his own heritage was not The Godfather or Goodfellas, but an empowering and celebratory action-adventure tale about Sicily and Sicilian culture. Here was a kid who got to see his older cousin celebrating his culture in an exciting and engaging way, much like I did with my nanu growing up. And in that quiet moment between us at Festa, everything seemed to come full circle. Here I was, now I, the old knight, knighting the young squire before me, and instilling it with the Treviso family's noble values. And so it is, I have the esteemed honor of not only carrying on my nanu's name, but also in continuing to carry on his values by celebrating our great Sicilian culture through acts of creativity and conservation. And I just hope I'm making him proud. Grazie. So I thought it'd be fun to open up the floor to questions and have more of a dialogue at this time. Yes?
So it's probably just for coincidence, but does your grandfather's passion for gondola making come from the fact that his last name is a city, sort of like a sort of second city of Veneto, like sort of just a few kilometers from Venice itself?
That's a great question. So she asked, so my last name is Treviso, and Treviso comes from the city of Venice. And the question was, is it a coincidence that my grandfather built gondolas and my name also comes from the Venice area? And to my understanding, yes it is. I think it is a coincidence. I actually haven't done the research on this to really confirm whether or not my family did come from the Venetian area. But given the fact that it was kind of known that you would, when you immigrated around the world, you would take the last name from the city you came from. So there is a good chance that at some point in history, my ancestors came down from the Venice area and settled in Sicily. But as in terms of the gondolas, it was just an aesthetic appreciation. You know, like, why do people love what they love? Art, you know, resonates with different people in different ways. Some people like pop music, some people like country music. He just, as a shipbuilder, he just always appreciated the aesthetic and the allure of that gondola, that sleekness and like the allure, you know? Great question. Yes?
The novel exists started around 1280,
1282, yep.
1282. And what's the time period, 1282 to what?
So the War of the Sicilian Vespers, actually, it lasted for about a year. So 1282 to 83. And spoiler alert, and anybody can find this on Wikipedia, but what happened is that the Spanish eventually came in and helped the Sicilians fight, but then they took over. They never left. They came in and they never left. So the Spanish came in and then they reigned on the island for the next, I don't know, 200, 500 years.
So it doesn't go, there's nothing in the book relevant to Sicilian history after that time.
No, the book very much is a very condensed time frame. So that speaks to the thriller genre. So like I mentioned, Sicilian is a historical thriller, and what that means is it's written in a very urgent kind of tone. So short chapters, cliffhangers, a very compressed time frame. So the book really only covers a period of maybe 2 weeks, because like it's supposed to kind of keep you engaged in the present moment.
I'm just going to add something. I think the premise of your book to show that Sicily is very different from the stereotype, okay, is a call to all Italian authors or Italian American authors to try to set the record straight, not only about Sicily but for the rest of Italy. I think it's a very commendable approach to what you've done, and the book is really, really well written, and you're absolutely true. When you read this book, you want to go from page to page to see what's happening. It's a book that is extremely well written, and congratulations on it. Well done.
Yes, thank you. To that point, I've had quite a few people come up to me in person, and on Amazon people leave reviews, and it's one of those books that people say, you know, I started reading at 9 o'clock at night, I was just gonna read a few chapters, and then since they're so short, and they have cliffhangers at the end of it, I read the next one, and the next one. And I'm like, oh gosh darn it, and they keep reading, and then before they know it, it's 2 in the morning. So that was the best thing that I've probably ever heard.
That is absolutely true, because when I read the book the first night, I only intended to read like for 15 minutes, and I read the first 200 pages. Because it keeps you going. You want to turn the page. You really have to. I want to also say, the Carlo will be here if you want to purchase the book, and he'll sign it. They'll make great Christmas gifts. But it is definitely a book that if you read it, you want to turn the next page. You want to see what happens to get to that very last page.
Yes, and if I can make a tonal comparison, I kind of equate it to like, it's structured very much like a novel like the Da Vinci Code, where you know you get the action adventure story, but you also get a lot of historical context. So I take a lot of care to describe the cultural influences in the book. So the architecture where the scenes take place. I feature illustrations that I showed in the presentation. I incorporate a lot of the language, a lot of the cultural background, like the marionette shows and stuff like that. So it's kind of like what do they say? You're eating your vegetables, but it tastes like dessert, kind of thing. So.
Hey Frank, I'm just going to add something else. I think it's a great book for people to read about Sicily, about all of this is their heritage. It's a very quick introduction for people to go on above and beyond to learn more about the art, the architecture, the culture, the food, the wine, etc. It's a good teaser. It's a good appetizer to get people to really learn more about their culture.
Absolutely. And when my sister went, so my sister went to Sicily this past summer. She took the book with her and she was kind of reading it as she was going. And the tour that she went on a tour. And it took her on the same path that the book kind of takes you on. So it starts in Palermo, you get the Vespers uprising, the rebellion starts, and then you follow the Siciliana's journey as she kind of goes through Sicily fighting the French. And the tour happened to take her on that same path. So as she was going through Sicily, she was taking these photos, and she's like, I'm at the part where Etna starts the rebellion, and now I'm at the part where Etna fights the French on Mount Etna. And she it was really interesting seeing her essentially walk in the footsteps of the characters in the book. So by the end of her trip, she was in Taormina, where in the book, that's where the climax of the book takes place, where the people of Taormina also rise up, like Palermo. So I thought that was, my sister kind of showed me, like, that's exactly what I wanted to happen. I wanted people to be able to go to Sicily on a tour by themselves and trace the footsteps of this story in a very organic way. Yeah.
Do you plan to have this written in Italian?
Yes, I get that question a lot. I would love to have it translated into multiple languages. That's a huge effort. Definitely something to do in the future. But yes, that is a goal, for sure.
You can have it translated into Sicilian.
Oh gosh. Well, I hear my dad's looking for work, so. Yes.
Fantastic. I had a great appreciation for history. And what I really sensed with the Teutonic bases that you provided, and with the influx of French and then the Spanish, maybe this is why Garibaldi chose Sicily to begin the famous march and the unification of not just Sicily, but all of Italy. They just said, enough is enough, or as we would say, basta.
Well, exactly to that point, Sicily was once considered the center of the Mediterranean. I mean, you had Africa, Israel, Europe, and that Sicily was smack in the middle. So as people were cross-migrating and conquering each other, Sicily was always that stop. And it was full of lemons and wheat and all this kind of stuff, so it was the breadbasket. So that's probably what, I mean, it was said that Sicily was once the breadbasket of Rome. So when the Romans took over, they really helped, propagate those wheat fields, and they used the wheat to feed the Roman expansion across the entire planet, basically. So, I mean, there's probably a reason why military leaders would start in Sicily based on the resources there. And, oh, yes?
I apologize if I offend anybody, but I don't know how well your research was. I'm Sicilian. Folklore, what I've heard, I've never seen it in writing, but from what I understand, many of the French soldiers were removed with a certain part of their anatomy, which was put into barrels and sent back to King Charles in Naples.
That is most likely definitely true, yes. The book has so if I may speak to that for a minute, I'm glad you asked. So during the Sicilian Vespers uprising, which it hits like about right in the middle of the book. So you have a little bit of plot to go through. You get the uprising, and then you get to the revolution, the rest of the story. And according to the historical records that exist about the Sicilian Vespers, it was incredibly violent and vulgar. I don't talk about that specific story where they were gutting French soldiers and putting their entrails into baskets. But there is a lot of other things I talk about which are pretty intense. But yeah, I mean, there was a lot of violence back then. But again, this is not I wouldn't say it's a pro-violence book at all. So at the end, I kind of talk about how, violence is never the answer, and like, sometimes it can be used for good. And I have a little, statement at the end there. But yeah, I mean, I'm not shy about the historical violence shown in the novel, based on the history. Yeah.
So that's it. I'm remiss to. I forgot to say something. I really forgot to say. I have to say that Dante Alighieri also has a language school. I totally forgot to bring up the fact that we have a premier language school here. So if anyone's interested in learning Italian, we teach Italian to adults. Okay, so if you're interested, come to that. Other thing we'd like to invite you. We have some Sicilian wine. As we're doing Siciliana, so we have some Nero wine and some hot hors d'oeuvres. So you're more than welcome to have a glass of wine and just chat with the author. Like, this book is available for sale. We'll sign it for you, dedicate it to whomever.
Absolutely.
So we thank you for coming.
Cent'anni, as we say.
Cent'anni.